Welcome, everybody. Those of you that have been with us on second day Rosh Hashanah know that Rabbi Artson and I conduct a dialogue. Rabbi Artson, my colleague and friend who runs the service in Barad Hall, but since we're obviously not there, or in the main sanctuary for that matter, we're doing it virtually. And we decided to take a classical idea as opposed to talking about the pandemic or politics or any of those things. And that is to just ask about forgiveness. How does one forgive when someone hurts you, especially if it's a real hurt or a lasting hurt? And so, Rabbi Artson, I think I will start off by asking, what is it like to forgive? What does it feel like?
So I will say for me, it's always been a challenge because in the general Christian culture, there's a sense that you forgive preemptively, and that there's something wrong with you if you harbor anger or you can't forgive. I've always thought there's deep wisdom in Judaism's teaching that you have to forgive people, but only after they sincerely repent and only after they apologize and make it right. I think there's some depth to that notion that this isn't one-sided and this isn't largesse. This is something that you earn in a relationship, and you have to earn that forgiveness. But what about the people who don't? Right? And so the issue I think that I'd love to hear your thoughts on too is, what about the way we give these people real estate in our hearts? Because we're the one that's holding on to the anger. We're the one that's remembering a hurt from last year or 5 years ago or 30 years ago. And we're the ones that keep revisiting it. They, for all we know, have moved on in their lives. So for me, the key part of forgiveness is what it does for the victim, for the person who's been wronged, to be able to say, I'm not giving you internal space anymore. You don't get here.
I have a pet theory about this. About why it's so hard to forgive. I think one of the reasons, maybe the main reason why it's so hard to forgive someone is because when someone has done you wrong, you, in a weird way, win. You win the moral competition. Mm-hmm. I'm better than that person. And to really forgive, not just to sort of forgive, but to really forgive is to say, I no longer think of myself as better than this person. This is not the person who I'm nice enough to say you're forgiven, but we all know what you did to me and I'm really better than you. But actually we're back on the same moral plane. And that's very hard to do when somebody has hurt you. There's an old phrase about burying the hatchet, but as a comedian once said, nobody ever forgets where they buried the hatchet. And so there is this sense that, I may say that I forgive you, but I'm really, I just want you to know that the thing that you did to hurt me, it's okay. It's all right.
All right. So that's proof positive, just in case any of you are listening, looking for it, that Rabbi Wolpe is a much greater saint than I am.
How so?
I would think that part of what the challenge of forgiveness is we want to see the SOB punished.
Oh, there's that too. Yeah, I forgot.
Sorry, that's my background.
No, I don't. Right. Exactly.
You're above all of that. I get that. Yeah. But for us lesser mortals, there's a sense that if I forgive that person, then they're not going to get their just punishment. The whole book of Jonah, which we're going to read soon enough, is all about Jonah saying, God, I don't want to go tell the Ninevites to repent because they're awful and you're going to forgive them. And then there'll be no consequences and they get away with it. Right? And I think that's part of the challenge.
And this is built into us from very young. I mean, it's part of human nature. We know that kids have an intrinsic sense of fairness. In fact, even in babies, they've done studies where, for example, they'll have two puppets and one treats the other badly, and kids react to the bad puppet differently than they do to the good puppet. Yes. So there is that, absolutely, there is that sense that the other person should get their just desserts. But I also am attracted by the idea that if you can forgive,
Mhm.
you have released yourself.
Yes.
That to wish to hope for vengeance, as I've heard it in several people's names, but I first heard it in Annie Lamott's name. The writer is to swallow rat poison and wish someone else would die. In other words,
that's exactly right.
It hurts you, but it doesn't hurt them.
That's right. So being able to forgive, even in the absence of apology, even in the absence of contrition on their part, it's really about releasing yourself and being able to move forward.
And how do you do that? Like, do you have any advice? It's Rosh Hashanah. How do we do it?
So I've done it fairly well once. I had once. I want to tell you a story about a different one, because I have a case where someone apologized 30 years later.
Wow.
Remarkable story. But this case, I had a close relative who was pretty abusive throughout my childhood and teen years, and has never apologized. Never. I think to this day doesn't know that they did anything outrageous. Right. And for me, at some point, it was about, this person's no longer actively in my life, and so I can spend time chewing how abusive they were and how terrible, but that's my life. Like, I'm giving them more time. It's bad enough they had those years. So I just resolved to wish them well. And there's, there are techniques from Buddhism, from Hasidic meditation, where you actually sit and you wish well on the person. And you do that until it comes from a real place, so it's not like, oh yes, I really bless you. It's got to be deep. And I knew I had done something, because the last time I actually ran into this person, which is not often, I was really able to be my current self with them. I wasn't thrown back into that younger victim. I was me, living a wonderful life and being able to meet them in that fullness. And that, I think, is the transition is, can you not be thrown back into the older self, the one who was hurt?
Mm-hmm. And what's I'm curious, the 30-year story that you mentioned.
So my kids know of this guy from my school and grade school who they know only as Bully. I never told him his name. And he used to beat me up every single day at school. I know that's hard to believe, because I give such a macho impression.
Exactly. I can't imagine.
No, but so he used to pound me every afternoon during physical education for 2 years. I was black and blue on my entire arm. And the only time I hit him back, my grandfather had told me that if someone calls you a Jew, you hit him and ask them what they mean by it. So I would hit, but it was like hitting a refrigerator or a tank. He was gigantic, and he would mostly just look surprised, and then he would knock me to the ground. So 2 years of that, and then went to high school. And in high school, he kind of grew up a bit, and we were fine. I was at my 40th high school reunion, and he walks over to me. And I just want to tell you, David, he's still gigantic. So, I'm like, oh, and all my high school friends are looking with like, oh, here we go again. And he said, I need to tell you, I feel terrible. I wasn't, like, that isn't me. I'm not that person. And this is, years later. And I said, listen, thank you. That's great. But you're not that guy anymore. And no one should be blamed for what they did in 7th grade. And he started to cry, this huge. And he said, no, I need to apologize. And I think that was right. And that was the moment that the Jew in me kicked in. He's not Jewish. And I said to him, I want to tell you something in our tradition. Judaism teaches that when you sincerely regret something you've done and you sincerely apologize, that you're no longer the person who did it. In fact, our tradition teaches that sin becomes to your credit. So you now are carrying something I don't have to carry anymore. That was the most amazing moment of tshuva.
That is an amazing moment. I would have said to him, our tradition teaches that the Mossad will come and get you. And that will be, right, exactly.
Soon enough.
An ancient teaching of our tradition.
Don't turn your back.
These guys will come at night. I think that the interesting and in some ways indescribable part of this is what goes on inside of you. And there is that trigger when you think of the person who has hurt you,
Yeah.
that, the anger that comes up, and to work with that, and also to understand that most people, that when they genuinely hurt, it comes out of their own woundedness, and to be able somehow to find compassion for the person who has hurt you is also difficult, incredibly difficult, but also incredibly important. Just that I'm sure you felt compassion for him at that moment, but to feel compassion for the person, even if they don't apologize or you don't know them, that's a hard but worthwhile endeavor, at least.
And I think the challenge for me is also there's a way in which we keep revisiting the same issues again and again and again.
Right.
And that builds into the anger, so that it's at some point not even anger at them. It's just anger at whatever had transpired. And so partly for me, it's also about not having it become a flashback where you get captivated and drawn back.
It has to do with the kind of person you want to be in the world. Right, exactly. And also, I think for those of you, since you talked about, talking about this guy with your kids, also the kind of modeling that you want to do for other people. Is there a fear, do you think, of being weak, that people don't want to forgive because they feel as though to forgive somebody is to be weak, and to hold on to a grudge and to be angry is to be strong?
Well, let me say two things about that. I think that there's a way in which righteous indignation sometimes legitimately gets in the way of forgiveness. Yeah. Like I admire that Judaism says, no, you really have to earn the full forgiveness. Don't keep perpetuating that.
Right.
And then thinking, because there are times where people are wronged, and the right response is anger. Anger is a legitimate way of saying, no, this is intolerable. I shouldn't put up with this. So I want to honor that. And then I also want to say to the congregation that you don't forgive until you're ready, right? And I want us to have a kind of peace for that It may be that eventually we want to work towards forgiveness, but I struggle with weight, and my mother's very helpful in always telling me how much I'm struggling with the weight, and I do keep saying to her, and when I'm ready, it comes off, but not until then. Because it's not about food, it's about bigger things. And that's true with forgiveness too. At some point, your heart will open, you'll turn a corner and you'll say, this is no longer a live burning issue, and now I'm ready to do the work of forgiveness. But you can't rush that.
I do think that it is, as you say, it's important that people not add a tremendous burden of guilt to their burden of anger. Why haven't I forgiven that person yet? Yeah. And it is also true that certain things require anger. I am concerned that we live in a society that is so angry that I would rather err on the side of telling people to be less angry, because there's so much telling them you should be angry about this and you should be angry about that.
Right. So you're right. We do live in such an age of hyper-partisanship and hyper-judgmentalism that it's not only that someone is wrong, but they're also evil. And that seems to be everywhere. So, yes, I think our job in this age, and especially today, is to urge people to lean in on the side of compassion and forgiveness. Compassion to yourself, in that forgiving is a gift you give yourself, and forgiveness for the other, that they are imperfect human beings, and although you may not agree with them, many of them are trying their best.
So I'm glad that we brought it around to oneself. I think that that's a nice way to talk about as we come to the closing minutes of this, is that even people who can forgive others sometimes can't forgive themselves. Right. Because they did something that they regret, that has consequences, they hurt people they love, and I think we all hurt people we loved in different ways at different times.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's really hard to say, I'm not going to beat myself up about this anymore because I know that I'm just a person. And I do find in counseling, I'm often telling people, you're just a person. You didn't, you're not supposed to be perfect. Where do you think where does that come from? That sense of inability to accept our own frailty?
I think it's related to the fact that we live our life through a microscope and we see each other's lives on Facebook. So from a distance, the other is happy, perfect, socializing all the time, popular, whatever, and we're aware of how often we're alone and how often we fall short and all the things we were going to do that we didn't get to do. And I think we're harder on ourselves most of the time than we are on others. And that self-loathing, maybe it comes from us having been small and vulnerable and having to grow into adulthood. Maybe it has to do with seeing our own life up close and magnified and others at a distance and through cosmetics. But I do think our work in this season especially is to tell people that you're supposed to love your fellow as you love yourself. And again, the genius of Torah, that you can't love your fellow if you don't first love yourself. So, and that's work. It's a commandment. You have to work on self-love in order to be able to share that love.
And just as a corrective, self-love, of course, does not mean that everything I do is wonderful or good or
well, in your
fabulous.
case, it does, but for most people, it doesn't.
Okay. Oh, all right. No, but seriously, I mean, that's because we do also live in an age of a certain narcissism. Self-love does also, like all love, include boundaries and self-criticism. It doesn't mean that you never criticize yourself because you love yourself. And right. That's important to say,
That's
too.
That's right. Well, and look, I think the paradox of Jewish tradition is because we know we are loved, we can mobilize the courage to be self-critical. It's when you don't think that you're loved right. that you can't admit that you made a mistake.
Yes, I think that is exactly right. And this, I mean, traditionally was part of the role of God's love. You know that you are unique in the universe, that you have a spark of God in you, and therefore, even though the tradition spends a lot of time criticizing you on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, you also know that you are of particular interest and focus to the creator of the world, and therefore there is a Yom Kippur when God cares how you approach the whole question of sin and forgiveness.
Look, and I think it's not a coincidence that we launched this whole time of penitence with a thing called slichot, which is forgiveness. Yes. You start off knowing you're forgiven, and now go work on how you can be better. Right? And that's exactly the power of knowing that we're covenanted with God and that God's love is there to inspire us to do the work.
So I want to thank you so much for participating in our dialogue once again this year. I don't know how many years it's been, but it's been a bunch of years. Wow. And I hope those of you that will be joining us for Ne'ilah will come in time at the beginning of Ne'ilah. Rabbi Artson and I will take a few minutes to introduce the Ne'ilah service. So thank you. Shana Tova. May it be a happy, healthy, and a wonderful new year.
And you
Bye-bye.
too.
Go right into it.